Let me present a paradox about the American combat veterans and how they chose to recount their combat experience, starting with the Civil War. After that war, the veterans came home to their homes or to their farms, north and south. At first, they couldn't talk about the war because it was too painful. But by 1875, only 10 years after the war was over, they began to talk to anyone who would listen to them about the war. They began to publish their diaries. They were willing to talk, and they talked for the next 50 years about their war experiences to their children, to their grandchildren. They virtually controlled the United States government for almost 50 years because of a fraternal organization which the Union veterans founded called the GAR. It stands for the Grand Army of the Republic. GAR controlled Republican politics to a remarkable way. Do you realize that every president, from Grant, 1868, to McKinley, his assassination was in 1901, every president, with the exception of one, was a Union Army veteran. Every president, with the exception of one, was also a Republican. The one, by the way, was Grover Cleveland, who was elected twice. But they talked about the war, and at every Decoration Day, as Memorial Day was called in those days, they would be there with their uniforms on, if they still fit in their uniforms, or at least with their caps on. They still fit in their caps. And they would exude kind of a tin horn patriotism. They would raise the flag and play taps. Up to our parents' time, the people still remember the GAR veterans. In the South, it was the same way. Of course, there were less of them. They would meet in their, usually in the grocery store in the small town, and sit around a stove. They were called the United Confederate Veterans, and they would talk about what they called the lost cause. But they talked. As a young man, I interviewed old men who had been as boys with their fathers to those United Confederate Veterans meetings. The questions were we all at Shiloh? That was bad. Or another declaration, you know, we all come up to Gettysburg in the summer of '63, and some of us come back and some of us didn't, and that's all there is to it, except for the details, and I'll tell you about the details. But the point is, they talked about their war experiences. Everyone who is my age or over remembers the World War I veterans, the doughboys, they called themselves. They never stopped talking about the war. It was the American Legion and the veterans of foreign wars and the conventions. It was Mademoiselle from Armiteers and over there, and it's a long way to Tipperary, and pack up your troubles in your old kit bags. It was Jimmy Cagney in the Fighting 69th. World War I to the doughboys became their currency after the war. Eventually, in December of 1941, that talk suddenly slowed down and was no longer interesting. Now, here comes the paradox. After World War II, it didn't happen that way, and I don't know why. There was just silence. The GIs came back, there was just silence. I began my college career the year they came back, and I was in with a whole lot of fellows who were in the GI Bill. They were veterans, they were in their 20s or 30s, but never did they talk about their war experiences, and I don't know why. I would ask specifically about their war experiences, and I would get a cursory answer like, yeah, I was in the Pacific. It was considered in the vernacular of that day corny. In fact, the whole idea of war stories, he's telling war stories, became a pejorative. Don't tell war stories. And it's too bad, because we lost a lot. This is why Stephen Ambrose's trilogy, The Victors and D-Day and Citizen Soldiers, becomes such a seminal work, because it was collected, voices collected before the voices and the memories fade. For long years, a generation of World War II veterans lost its public voice, and the patriotism and the sacrifices were largely forgotten by non-veterans. Again and again, I've heard that complaint after funerals of a World War II veteran. The preacher's up in the altar extolling his wonderful combat experience and how brave he was and how it changed his life. And the children are sitting in the front pew with wide-eyed expressions looking at each other, said, "Our father never told us he was in the war." Strangest thing, it's curious. A man by the name of Barrett, who wrote a book, kind of a bestseller a couple of years ago called Flags of Our Fathers, recounted the fact that he lived in a normal family with his father through his father's life until his father died. It was only after his father's death that he learned that his dad had been one of the 5 GIs who raised the flag at Mount Suribachi after the bitter Battle of Iwo Jima. Well, inevitably, some sort of a reversal is due. I believe it began in 1994 with the attention paid to the 50th anniversary of the Normandy landing. Here, family members saw in the military cemeteries the aging veterans finally break down and weep at the graves of their remembered comrades, and then talk for the first time proudly and openly of their war experiences. The silence was broken. The willingness of the veteran of World War II to finally tell his experiences to a younger generation, the one that will lead us through the 21st century, has begun and will continue to aid them in appreciating the sacrifices made by the World War II veterans, by the American fighting forces. After all, they gave everyone the right to live freely, which is probably the noblest achievement of the 20th century. It is my hope that their reminiscences will live with Americans as long as they are able to trace their heritage.